We are live. I'm going to skip over committee discussion, which means we're only 20 minutes behind, and we're going to start with the supplemental district spending. We've had several discussions on this, but this and the weights are two big things I think we have to discuss. We were pretty close yesterday on the homestead exemption. I think we decided we were going to stick with the homestead exemption, and we were doing baby steps in blue and white sections and stuff. We'll see increases and decreases. So I'm going to start with Jane. And I guess John, you'll get our ears back on.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for giving the tax department a little bit of time today. I know time is really precious right now. I have a short PowerPoint slides, and there's a handout, same thing under my name on the website. Jake Feldman, Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Tax Department. Yeah, looks like this, and one of the slides is just that, so there's no only slides to it. It's just so we're talking about supplemental district spending. We're going to talk for a second about allowable levels, and then talk for a second about the potential equalization mechanism, which maybe you might get dealt with next year. We're not sure, but the allowable levels seem like somewhat urgent to discuss right now. So as H454, as it's the most recent draft, it does allow districts to choose to spend an extra 10% above their educational opportunity payment, basically all their foundation formula money, and it's called supplemental district spending.
Somebody asked us at some point, is that per student? Or is this where that?
Are you asking me?
I'm
Sure.
throwing it out.
Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office, the supplemental district spending. And I think Jake is getting to this, but currently it's calculated as a percentage over the education opportunity payment.
Okay.
It gets into a per student for the purpose of using the supplemental district spending yield as passed by the House.
Yep. Thank you, Julia. So the current allowable level is 10% over the education opportunity payment, and that represents potentially up to an additional $190 million of education spending. So that's a lot. Because that's 10%.
Yeah. What do you mean by current? Yeah, what do you mean by current?
Past the House, right?
What
Are you looking at the House version or the Senate
This is just,
version?
both?
And both of current is 10% over.
yeah, 10%.
Yeah. Like they allow up to that.
Yeah.
As supplemental.
Right. That is, if everybody did it, it would be 190 million.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, up to.
Yeah.
And the squiggly thing means around. So sorry, the math tilde. Math tilde.
That was the question. It was the weighted or unweighted.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. So if it was instead 5%, that would be half as much, 95 million. And so I know it's late in the game. I'm going to introduce a new concept where the limit is 5%, but it's based on unweighted pupil count. So it's not building off the EOP.
Yeah.
It's building off unweighted pupil count. And we'll see why. Well, here are some reasons why. Oh, green arrow. We're recommending that third thing.
Okay.
Okay, so why?
Did that just happen?
Green arrow?
You didn't touch anything, it just appeared.
Yeah, you know, we need to introduce drama.
Can you do that again?
Technical, probably, but I don't know.
I missed it.
Okay, so why are we saying that? Well, H454 already locks in current total education spending through its base and weights. Like if you've seen quite a few presentations, I think, on this, where it really tries to spend the same as current. That's what it's doing. So any supplemental spending is additional education spending that would also fall on property taxes absent another source. And a lot of the work we're doing this year is because of concern around property taxes. This is adding property tax pressure. It may not be a state rate, it might be a local rate, but still from a taxpayer experience, it's more property taxes. So that recommended approach with the green arrow is a little bit lower. So it gets closer to existing spending levels. It still would be up to $62 million over. And importantly, as Professor Colby was describing, the educational opportunity payment, no matter how it's configured, is designed already to capture the varying costs of educating different student types. That's what it does. It's designed to provide an adequate education and give you the money you need for your different students. So that is that big pot of money. So that supplemental district spending is something else. And it's not really well defined in the bill what it should be used for, but it's some whipped cream type additional spending. Okay, so here is the math of what I'm talking about and a little example. So I have two districts that both have the same number of regular and long-term non-weighted students, 4,000. But after the weights are applied, District A has 6,000 students and District B has 8,000 students. So their education opportunity payment under the base, the H454 would be, 89.2 for the first one and 119 for the second one. With that limit that's in the bill, the first district A could spend an additional 9 million and the other one could spend 12 million. And if it was half as much, then of course that would be half as much. But what we're proposing is that you would take that base amount, 14,870, and then go back and multiply it by their unweighted pupils. And that is what you use to create their allowable supplemental spending. And notice my color coding, because the districts, they have the same amount of regular unweighted pupils and they would have the same amount of allowable supplemental spending. Yeah, so it's an affordability thing. Things are looking expensive. The tax rates yesterday were scary, and we're seeing where things can be cleaned up a little bit and tightened up. So this is one of them.
So Jake, if the committee, in further committee conversation, were to lean towards a world where we don't use the 100% that came out of cost factor analysis, the 14,870 that came out of Senate Ed or came out of the House, but instead found an evidence-based base amount that was somewhere like the 14,200, while simultaneously wanting to increase this limit to not just be 5%, but allowing districts, especially whatever, to go up to 10 or 15%. You don't think that would that change your recommendation and how you see how these numbers work if the base amount were lower than what passed the House and passed Senate Education?
I mean, this is a little bit out of my field of expertise, because if the education opportunity payment was sort of designed to be 90% of what it should be, then maybe somebody would make a case like, you're not giving us enough money based on our student population. And so then this would be like maybe less desirable. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like this is desirable because the education opportunity payment is giving
Is it?
them the right amount of money.
The current possible. The current
Yeah,
amount.
mathematically it still works great, but it's, you know, this
Yeah.
gets into the legal realm of it.
That gets it into not. Can we afford a math teacher, but can we afford sports uniforms, or can we afford the cafeteria? But it's not into the adequacy realm. If we cut it, then that above, if we have stated that 15 is what it takes, and we only provide 13, then that 2 million gets into the adequacy realm, and you have more trouble with Brigham. Unless we can make it significantly cheaper for poor towns to raise that extra money.
I don't, after the previous testimony and now talking more, I just don't buy that argument, because otherwise I think we'd have lawsuits all over the place right now. If truly supposed to be spending 1533, that's what we should be spending. Then we should be having
We aren't
lawsuits all over the
making-
place.
We aren't making the decision. The people that would bring the lawsuit would probably be the local voters. That might find a family that values it, wants something in education in a low spending town. They could, but the state hasn't said, this is what you have to spend to be in education. If we go to a foundation formula, then the state is saying, this is what it takes to provide an adequate education. And we are therefore, now we can say we're gonna do 95 and the town has to do 5. And then we can do an equalization. This is how I was hearing Professor Colby. But once we state, this is the foundation, this is what it takes to provide an, you know, evidence-based, this is, and choose your evidence base. You can do Professor Colby's, you can do Picus, or you can find another one out there, but those are the two biggies nationally. You can choose one or the other, but the minute you choose, then we, the state, have said, this is what it takes. And if you say, this is what we can say, this is what it takes. Now, if we don't have anything to base it on, we'll probably have a problem. But if we have a reason to say, this is what it takes, we can say, we're gonna provide 90% of that, and the towns have to do 10. That's fine, I think, because I'm gonna look, I don't know if I'm, look at John, if I'm off the wall. But in order to avoid Brigham, because that's kind of the foundation formula we had before, and Standard, because they have almost no tax base, they're not merged with somebody, but they were the poster child. Standard had to have a tax rate of $3 in some sense to raise the same amount of money per student that was costing one of the ski towns 24-25 cents. So, or they were raised, no, they had a 28-cent tax rate. So that was the inadequacy. It cost a whole lot more, but well, the towns didn't raise it because they couldn't afford it. So we have to make sure, once we set this is an adequate amount, which is what the foundation is, we can say the state's going to pay this and the town's going to pay that. We have to equalize it so that all towns can raise it with the same amount of paying. We can do that. But right now, the towns are deciding this is an adequate amount.
But to get Colby's point on that, and I agree with her, that Brigham proved that it's the state's ultimate responsibility,
It is,
even though
yes.
we delegated authority, responsibilities on us. And
Well, we're responsible for raising the money.
But Brigham was also based on the ability to raise the same amount per student, regardless of tax base. It wasn't actually based on the amount of spending per pupil and saying this was an adequate amount to spend per pupil. It was based on how much can a town raise based on their tax capacity. And so that's why Act 60 created a tax capacity formula to equalize across tax capacity, so that each town has the same ability to raise the same amount based on their grand list. And it wasn't saying we think the adequate amount is X number of dollars, and but that's what a foundation formula would be doing, is saying this is what the state deems as the adequate amount in order to meet certain standards. And if we're not funding that, then the state is responsible because we've chosen the standard and then we've not funded it. And because it's a statewide property tax, we're all funding it together, saying this is what we're all funding. So putting it on to the locals doesn't really make any sense, and it becomes, that's when it becomes a problem with the tax base and how places can fund that, because you'd be putting it on to the local tax base by asking them to do it. But I think Chris had.
I don't-
No, sorry.
I don't think anybody here is talking about putting local education spending onto a local tax base.
No.
Or local grant list. I mean, all we're saying is that, I think, well, I'd say,
That's what this.
all some people are saying is that we can fund up to some percentage, I don't know, it's 85 or 90. And we will all pay the same rate for that amount of money. If you decide to spend more than 85% or 90%, then the state will still pay that bill. But we will use an equalization ratio to assign tax rates based on a local decision. And that is all 100% Brigham compliant. That's what we do right now.
Right, but that,
would raise up those low spending districts.
that,
But it leaves it to locals to pass the budget to say, we're gonna spend that extra 15% to get up to the same level that another district is at. And to get up to the level that the state has set.
Right now, the floor is 64%. We're talking about raising it to 85%. If nobody's suing anybody right now when we're at 60, the property yield is the floor right now. I mean, it's all a state education fund. It's all equalized. It's just a matter of, do you want to take part in 100% spending, or can you provide adequate for 85 or 90 or 95?
but,
We don't all have to spend the same.
but that leaves. See, right now, it is your local towns that decide. All right, so if you're a local town and you're the 5 members on your school board don't really think the kids that live in their town need to know about robotics, they don't come up with the money to do that. Statewide property tax say, we, the state, who are responsible for education, think that every child should be exposed to music, to art, to robotics. They should have exposure if they have the, the skill to advanced math. We set the standards, which we do now. And we test for them. But the town decides what they spend to get it. And so if the town decides they don't want to spend that much, they may not get the best teacher to teach that. You end up with the situation where my grandson had a teacher that spoke Spanish, so they got Spanish one year, and that teacher left, and the teacher that came in did French, and so the next year he got French, and he got a Sesame Street level of language exposure and no real competency in any language. And we're trying, there's two goals here. One is to get the costs down. The other is to bring up those underperforming schools, those kids that are not getting the course curriculum choices they need to accept a green and gold scholarship and get into UVM.
85 to 90% is far above what we're doing right now. Far above what our minimums are right now. You do it too.
I just want to say, I'm not comfortable with saying 85, 90. Do I hear 92? Do I hear 87? We have a number that has been presented to us that is an adequate education. I am not interested in saying, well, you get 75% and you get 95. I want to work with something that's been empirically derived that will stand up to the throes of whatever is going to be out there. And I want to remind people, governor's goals: transparency, predictability, fairness, equity, and quality. Those are the 5 points.
And Tammy Colby was very clear about lawsuits. Seems that she runs studies for a lot of them. They are for adequacy. If the numbers that we were given were empirically derived, they did not take, this is what we're spending now. They took under our present system, so it is our present governance system. This is what it costs. This is what you should be spending to provide an adequate education. If you change the system, i.e. the number of schools, the number of superintendents, the number of whatever, the number of, all right, then that number will go down. But right now, this is the number under the present. And it's probably.
This is my concern. We do have two goals here, and the goals are our state's motto: freedom and unity. Under this plan, 100% of our current spending levels, okay, we will be okay, but it's more than what we're currently spending, and it will raise taxes and send more money to underspending districts, and it will lower tax rates and take money away from other districts and eliminate the need for possible vote. So I feel like this is too much unity and not enough freedom. And what every other state has done with these things is they have an actual foundation amount where they set an amount somewhere that's not 100% what current spend is. And then they leave it to districts to isolate that spending.
It's not 100%, Thomas. That's the thing, is that also you're not accounting for the fact that there are weights on top of it, which are providing additional funds for certain kinds of students. The 15,000 is based on how much it costs. It's not based on spending. It's based on cost, which is different.
And it's empirically derived.
It's a cost-based analysis. How much does it cost to heat the school building? How much does it cost to buy the supplies? How much does it cost to pay the teachers? How much does it cost to run the school bus? Those costs, and in order to meet a certain standard. And it's not the same for every district. Some of them, there is going to be redistribution happening. And I also think that it's really problematic to really focus on the tax rate thing that we got yesterday. It was a helpful exercise, and I really thank JFO for that. Thank you. It was a super helpful exercise, but it also is not what it's going to be in 3 to 4 years when this goes into effect. It is just a model to look at what if we had our current tax rates this year, or if we had a statewide tax rate.
I was in a state that was based on current spending, and I am under the impression we're spending too
It
much.
is based
And I
on,
want to advocate for voters to have a say in this. And in this scenario, we are taking away their say to a large extent. That causes me concern.
we are saying to towns, you cannot choose to spend an inadequate amount to educate your kids. The state of Vermont is responsible for making sure by constitution, which these other states do not have, many of them, that we are constitutionally required to provide an adequate education. It's probably very different now than it was in 17, whatever, but we're required.
Just don't think our current spending is equal. to
But
that.
this is not about current spending. This is about the future state. What Colby's model says is that if every town spent this amount, 15,000 per student, plus the weights, that would provide every student with an adequate education. It is irrelevant if some schools are spending more and some schools are, it is a base to work on.
Don't agree.
But going forward, we have levers we can pull in the revenue area, in how much above base spending. If we start by saying, well, okay, all the evidence, and we're right out there on YouTube, anyone that wants to can hear Professor Colby's, testimony that this is the adequate amount, and we start out and say, yeah, but that's a lot of money, so we're only gonna do, and then we'll leave it to the towns, which means you then have to equalize it. And the rich towns will end up spending more than the poor towns, and those same kids who need it most will get it least. And that's where your lawsuit's gonna come in.
That's my next slide too.
There you go.
Okay,
Really good
good,
slide.
let's go to your next slide.
It's a good one.
Okay, so, equalization mechanisms, I don't think anyone is contemplating like a go at your own kind of Wild West, pre-Brigham scenario where places that have more grand list will be able to pay more for kid. I haven't seen that proposed anywhere. The tax department had an initial proposal way back in the winter called the state guarantee, where the ed fund would basically match districts that are below the median grand list per student. It had some good aspects. We could figure out the match rates prior to town meeting day. One of the problems now is that everyone is sitting on town meeting day to happen before you can set the values. And so it looks like policymakers are making tax changes, but really they're just balancing the fund. So, so it had one pro, it had a few cons. That basically without a revenue source, it would be borne by the ed fund and therefore property taxes. The spending decisions of higher spenders could potentially impact lower spenders' tax rates. That wasn't ideal. We wouldn't know with 100% certainty what the ed fund exposure will be until budget votes are in, which is not great. And the cost of that depends on district configurations. What's in the bill now is what the House designed. The yield, there's a yield number. It's the grand list per student in the district with the lowest grand list per student. It has a couple pros. You could know that number prior to town meeting day, so everybody would know what they're working with. And the spending of higher spenders doesn't impact the lower spenders' tax rates. We learned how big of a problem that is last year with Act 127 implementation. People pointed that out. So those are the pros. There are a couple cons. You'd have a district with more grand list per kid would charge the same rate, but more money would be generated. But to keep that district from having an advantage, that money would be siphoned off. So they'd only have the keep of the lowest spending district. And that potentially pulls millions in property tax revenue away from the ed fund when the tax environment is looking quite challenging. Right now, everything gets shared. This would pull some into a different fund.
It goes into the school construction fund, right? After you make sure you've got a little cushion in case enough money doesn't come in.
Yeah,
So that could be a pro too.
It could be.
Depending on your perspective.
it would need some simulations to know exactly how many millions could be potentially pulled away and maybe that's something that happens next year.
It
once the
also-
pictures are designed.
I had asked, and I don't know if they've had time, it also could be used to buy down tax rates the next year. It kept in the ed fund.
It could be, yeah. I'm trying to think if yeah, it's
I'm
possible.
not sure the districts that paid it would appreciate their money going to all the districts, but
I don't know that they'd appreciate it going to build schools in another district either.
Yeah, the exact impact of that one depends on the district configurations, which nobody knows yet.
Right.
Okay, so Senator Chittenden's yield concept, is, we think, the strongest one. The yield in this case is the average grand list per student in the state. We would know the yield prior to town meeting day, that's good. Higher spenders probably don't impact the lower spenders' tax rates, which I'll explain in a second. And the best thing about this is that it is a true yield that is easy to understand. Like when you think of the word yield, you think, oh, I'm gonna plant 25 feet of potatoes and I'm gonna get, 50 pounds. Like that's how much it yields. This is how much the grand list yields per student. We have been, tax and JFO and the rest of the world have been working with yields since Act 46, which aren't really yields. They're just numbers that we have to plug into our Excel file to make the whole ed fund balance. They're not yields.
Yeah, we got tired of being blamed for setting the tax rate, so we set the yield, which determines the tax rate.
Right, but it's not a neutral potato yield. It's like a very loaded, complicated yield. But this would be a true yield. It would be agnostic to spending. It would just be the grand list per student. There's a small con, and I think it's really small, that we wouldn't know with 100% certainty if it will raise the right amount. But based on historical patterns, it is likely to raise a little extra because the districts with, and I'd have to do a little research to prove this out, but the districts with higher property values tend to spend more historically.
Okay,
The variances to the ed fund would likely be small, like the ed fund has year-end variances that are bigger than this, but we need some simulations to know exactly, but that's our choice for litigation.
I remember several proposals by Senator Chin,
I talked a lot.
and I'm having trouble focusing on which one this is. So this was,
So this is where, I like what the state, what the House did, where they basically just set a recapture rate and that will just generate a ton of money. This is effectively splitting the difference. And what I like to say when I think about how this would effectively work, if this were adopted, we would be taking some of the old foundation formula and smacking on top of it on what we do now, a yield on just the optional supplemental district spending. So it's almost a merger of the two systems that Vermont is relatively familiar with. I do agree with Jake that it is likely to raise less money than what the House generated, but that arguably might be more fair. So I feel like this is a more fair approach where if the higher grand list to pupil ratio districts do raise money more, that will feed into and create a surplus. I too, as I think about what those districts are likely to look like, I would anticipate more likely to get a net revenue positive than negative.
I'm gonna ask, Julia, do you have this modeled at all that we can look at it?
I do not.
Yeah.
Senator Chittenden did send it my way, and I've been focusing on other priorities I've heard from the committee. So we can work on that. I will say that in terms of modeling it, what we've spoken about before, it ultimately will depend on your district configurations.
Yeah.
Right? So what is the grand list value within those districts? In theory, if every single district had the exact same grand list per pupil, then all of the equalization mechanisms would be the same. We're only talking about variance and how much money is going to the school construction special fund or going into this state guarantee. dependent on the variance and grand list per pupil. So I can talk about the mechanism, but in terms of modeling it further,
That's right. Okay. So. Because this is going to go to conference, we could put this in the bill, which means we're then going to go to conference with at least 2 variations and also the tax department's original out there.
Both of those are better than the tax department's, honestly.
Yeah.
One of the,
I mean, but we will have time to sit down and do a compare and contrast. If we decide we want to use a yield bond. So Senator, I'm gonna do Senator Goulart because she has a head like say, and then Senator Harding.
Huge. Yeah, I mean, so I actually just have a question because I've heard you mention it twice now about the tax environment not looking so hot. Is that, are you reacting to what we're doing with 454, or are you just saying generally the tax situation next year is not? Can you just expand on?
sure, yeah, I mean, it's, the committee has talked about it today. You have historically low spenders, such as places like Barry, you know, potentially going up quite a bit
Yeah,
in tax rate. So that's what I mean by the tax environment. So, and that's a difficult thing to
I just want to
follow. And then
make sure.
if you had potentially, if you think about it, like a place like Barry, then having this supplemental tax rate, that's even more pennies. And so it's quite challenging.
Yeah, got it.
Yes, I had Senator Harding, then Senator.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. My concern about the third proposal, the Chittenden proposal is one, the high spenders impacting low spenders tax rates. And you have a probably in there, but without knowing the districts and seeing it modeled, I think that's still a strong possibility that the high spenders would impact the low spenders tax rates. And that sort of exacerbates the problem that people are apparently trying to solve. And then I guess it also, one of the things about the House's proposal is it does generate revenue to put towards school construction. And so if we're not generating revenue for that purpose, where are we going to get that money? So there's not another proposal on the table for that, trying to get to that 20% that the state is apparently going to provide. But back to the previous slides about the amount and having it based on, instead of the EOP, having it based on just the pupils. I like that. Because I do think having it based on EOP is kind of double weighting. And this is supposed to be true supplemental spending. If we fund the to 100% of our education foundation amount, then this is true supplemental spending. And so I think that would be fine to put it toward just the pupil count. I don't know between the 5 and 10%, which is the right amount. And I think it depends on if we want to put limits on it, or what do we see this money for? Do we see it for new uniforms for the band, or do we see it for building schools, or do we see it for, robotic? What do we see? What do we imagine districts are going to be using this? Or is it just that the wealthy districts will raise more money than the non-wealthy districts, and it's just used to make them feel better? I don't know what it's for. So not sure if 5 or 10%.
That depends on what we set is the base. If we set the base at choose your empirical number, but something that has more than I don't think so behind it, then that should be new uniforms for the band, or maybe to put in, flowers in the driveway or something.
Yeah.
But it should be an enhancement above basic education.
Yeah.
So at that, And it's easier to increase, so if we start with 5 and it doesn't prove to be enough, it's easier to go to 10 than to start at 10 and go to.
Yeah, I agree. I would,
Start with the none, and then we go to 5, and then potentially 10. Because I don't want to choose a foundation formula but based on supplemental spending.
Okay, we can do that too.
I don't mean to draw a red line, but I don't think I could support a bill that doesn't allow for some supplemental district spending with how I envision this to materialize when it takes effect. It just seems critical to keep that one aspect that voters could still have a say, especially if a future legislature drastically local community that at least have a choice to bring something forward.
if you draft, that's what happened to Graymo, is that they underfunded the foundation formula. And that's why I am so adamant that we have to have an empirically based 100% funded foundation amount. And we have one of those in all of the proposals, the 15,033 and the rate to go along with it. The rest are not.
And that is in the House bill, right?
That is the House version.
So we can put that in our bill.
Well, that's a.
Right,
It's not an opinion,
Right.
it's empirically based.
okay, I'm just saying we can do this. And so we will.
Matos needs to speak now.
We took a long road to get here. Oh, Tom, your Senator Chittenden, what your option is for that is that you're looking to aim to help out the less property wealthy districts by getting a little bit better rate by using the average. It's going to be a little cheaper for them to raise the money, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive for the property wealthy districts. So that's kind of like the aim to average with that property yield, right?
It's all based on grand list of pupil. I don't see it as a higher effective rate. It's just they will end up drawing the same percentage rate across a larger amount of parcels with a certain amount. So you will have in the districts, the higher grand list to pupil ratio in both the House version and my version that have a greater grand list relative to their pupils. They will, in the House version and this version, or those districts that have the richer grand list to pupil ratio, just tax all of their parcels at the same rate that if they didn't have the different proportional ratio. So you're drawing more from that district simply because we drew lines where the value of the lands in that district are more relative to the values in the other district pupil calibrated.
And your point about not having a vote on that supplemental, I don't think I could support something that spends more than we currently are. So looking at Jake's presentation, the maximum amount could be $190 million more than we're spending now. If every district takes advantage of the supplemental spend,
But the base was lower.
Yeah, it works.
Then it worked.
then it works.
Just a quick, Jake, to your slides, just trying to understand the concept. Last page, if you can bring it up. Yep.
Wanted people to see you when you're talking and not.
Yeah.
The sharing.
Leave your presentation up there.
Yeah.
Um.
You're looking for the one with the green arrow.
I'd like to see that. Great.
I missed it. I was looking down at the slides on the screen. Geez, you have to recreate it.
You're almost there, I think. Awesome.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, so,
After Senator
yield is I'm looking at Senator Chittenden's proposal there. Yield is or any of them, I guess. Average grand list per student. You're talking about the homestead grand list of the district?
A good question.
Is it?
I hope so.
It depends on what the surcharge applies to. If it's applying only to the homestead grand list, then you'd probably want to look at that. But if it's applying to the total grand list, which is what each 454 has now, then you want to look at total.
Yeah.
It right now it goes to everybody. If we
Yeah.
spend.
Just me, I would hope that's the homestead grand list that we're talking about there. I think that
No.
is a much better connection. As far as the yield, Senator Cummings mentioned a little bit. I would really hope that instead of a yield number, we give them a rate. Like we say, it's gonna be, I don't know, 3 cents per hundred instead of
I don't know what that is.
3 cents per hundred of spending. So they spend $100 supplemental, they get a 3 cent tax rate. But they gotta do the math.
Yeah.
But it's perfect.
No, the yield, the school board does the math. I mean,
Oh.
I mean, people are familiar with the yield now. And I'm looking at that's a thought process they used to going through. You can see how much trouble we're having when we spend all day, every day doing
I
this.
know.
I'm trying to change as little as possible.
I think there's budget language in the bill that's where the district would translate that yield into a rate. So it says, if you choose to spend this, it will be a rate of.
Yeah, that's what the voters need to know
Yeah.
is we're spending 370 whatever dollars of supplemental and it's gonna
This is
cost
what
us
it's gonna be
5 cents.
tax rate.
Yeah.
And they should have me.
I know this question is gonna sound cheeky, but I mean it sincerely. If we're gonna underfund the foundation rate and then allow for supplemental spending, why don't we just keep doing what we're doing now? Because it doesn't
Okay, I've got an answer.
change anything.
Okay, so right now, if you look at the 119 school districts and what their effective tax rate is, there is a bunch to 30, 40, 50 that are spending $1.12, $1.08. I can bring that spreadsheet. That like Billy Julia's numbers from yesterday.
But we don't know yet because we're not there.
Julie's numbers from yesterday are just about this year, not the future state.
Putting that's an example of what it might look like if the districts did change, but even if the districts did change, we would be effectively applying a universal tax rate on the homesteads and non-homestead properties, which would be higher for districts that are currently underspending and lower for districts that are currently overspending. I think we agree to that point.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah.
Yesterday.
We've known that for a week. Okay. But
So what we would
But
say,
it,
yeah,
but it also doesn't go into effect for a number of years, and there are also other levers you can pull, especially if we had 4 tax classifications, property
I'll
class.
bring back to this voter. I think it's important to not concentrate power in Montpelier, and I see a great deal of utility in having voters have a say on some amount of spending. I
There are a
do
lot
want-
of states that don't vote on school budgets.
I don't know if I want to be that.
Not unusual.
town budget.
I don't know if I want to be one of those. That's right.
Okay. But how much the base purpose of all of this was that the state would raise and would set a rate that was adequate for education. That's a foundation formula. If we don't do that, we're not doing a foundation formula. Other states do not have a constitutional mandate. They don't have a Brigham decision. They've always done it this way. The states raise that other money in as many ways as there are other states. They also don't vote on local budgets. Do you know they have a slaughterhouse tax in some states?
I'm doing those.
Yeah. They have extraction taxes. That's how they funded the North Dakota State Bank. I guess I just learned we used to extract asbestos, but there's not a market for that anymore, so we don't have much to extract. So we don't have a lot of extraneous things to tax yet. So I don't know. I need to see your system up on the screen because
I can do that.
I'm trying to remember it and I've seen so many screens. I do have a memory of it and where you were setting it. I think it was 4 o'clock on a Friday. But I'm trying,
I could reorient people. to
because
what
there's
this is.
two, yes, there's your cups. There's 2 different ways. This is
Just-
how we're going to fund is how we're gonna meet Brigham if we allow. So first we have to decide if we're going to allow above foundation spending. Once we decide that, we have to decide how much. And then we have to decide that how we're going to raise how much. So I think what I'm hearing is we are going to allow above base spending. Is that,
Wait, what are we looking at here?
this is his, we're going to raise the above base. But the first question is, are we going to allow above base spending?
Yes.
I
go.
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Depends what
I'm
that
not
base.
sure
No
what-
base.
I like this.
Chris's condition.
Chris is conditional.
Wait,
I got
who's Chris?
next to you.
Oh.
Sorry. Randy, we allow with above base spending.
That.
No.
It's true.
Okay. Is that an absolute no, or because if we aren't allowing it, then we're finished?
Yeah, it makes sense.
We can go back and decide what the base spending is with no above base.
If the complexity expert has looked at the system and has decided it's complex enough and adding more to that complexity isn't helping it.
Okay,
So wait, you're a no on
He's a no.
base spending?
On supplemental spending.
On
on
supplemental
supplemental
spending, supplemental spending.
Even if the base were lower than the 100% it currently is at.
It adds undue complexity. It is more difficult to manage. It's more difficult to assign results to. I don't like it. I'm not enthused about it.
yeah, I have a one very definite no. I have 3 conditional no's.
Yeah, I'm mixed on it and I absolutely would not. I am absolutely 100% against not funding the foundation amount at 100%. So if that's if an 85% amount is combined with a supplemental spending amount, I'm a no completely on the bill total.
You guys okay?
I just made a note here of the new movie that's coming to theaters in Vermont, Mo, Larry and Curly Design Education Funding.
It's not fair.
You know, one of the
I think
problems we
that-
have with the funding system we have right now is the degree of complexity in trying to explain it. And when you start doing things like adding supplemental amounts based on this, that, and the other, that are still undefined,
What's the
our
difference?
emphasis ought to be on the competence that we expect and how we're going to measure what we do.
Okay,
Making it more and more complex does not help it.
let's go back then to the base funding. Because the decision on the base then will drive whether or not where we set the base will derive whether or not we do supplemental. And remember, that is not the base for now. It is the base. And we have a base from the House that used Professor Colby's cost-based model, not our present cost. This is a model she uses other places. This is what it costs to purchase the teachers with the skills, to purchase, the playground equipment, to purchase the gym floor, refinishing, whatever you want. This is what it cost. It's not our present spending. She says the 1,500 is below that. If we go with hers, or we can go with the administration's evidence base, it is also based on an ideal school, ideally sized. If you had that ideal, which we do not, it's arguable if anyone does, that this is what it would cost to provide all those services. The numbers he uses in schools are probably unachievable for Vermont unless we want to bus kids an hour each way each day. Or we get a Jetsons jet thing for each one of them, but so we're gonna have to apply his model. That's what the administration has been trying to do, is bring that down. But there's things that are not included in that base number that the administration gave us, like transportation, that are included in the base number that the House and the Senate sent us. So those aren't really apples to oranges. Up until this point, we've been talking about starting with a cost base. And we're starting, whether we like it or not, right now with what we're spending now, which some are spending above what they should according to the model, and some are spending below. By the time we get to Shangri-La, everybody should be spending the same per student. And that, if the models all work, should correspond with the evidence-based. All right, they're all evidence-based, they're just different evidence. But they're all nationally recognized. Professor Colby is doing the modeling for the Wyoming lawsuit over adequacy. I think we're safer sticking to some system that has some national recognition as valid, because everybody uses them, rather than say, well, we don't think so and we're Vermont and we're going to create our own validity based on what we think. I think that's how we got us here. But so we've got to decide. And right now, the plan is to go from the cost-based to the evidence-based. And we haven't gotten to the point of even talking about that transition, except how we're going to, ramp up and ramp down money. But most of that will be done next year. But we have to decide which model we're going to use. Or we're going to have a really good evidence-based reason for not using it. Remember that this is going to go to conference. So what we decide will be beaten out again.
One clarification, if it goes to conference and we send out the cost factor analysis and that's what the House sends, I don't think an evidence-based alternative is germane. Or would it be a defective report if you were to switch that? Or am I wrong?
No, everybody's going to an evidence-based, that's said in the intent that's the movement. It's specifically said, I believe in the House, right, that their intent is to move to evidence-based. But right now, we're starting with what we have, because you can't go to evidence-based until you get closer to their size numbers. Were never made the ideal, but closer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For me, it's a non-starter to not, sorry, I'm using a lot of double negatives. It's a non-starter to not start with a cost-based, outcomes-based formula that is empirically derived, that is Vermont specific, and that makes sense and will adequately fund education. So just agreed.
We have levers we can pull to adjust the tax rate once we get closer to doing the tax rate. We can't set the tax rates now. If the Department of Education goes away, we have another whole new ball game, and we'll be back here for 2 years. But
Can I, Senator, if you, what you just said is what we are saying is that for you, it's the House weights or nothing.
It's the House formula and weights or nothing. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm on the exact opposite side of that. I will not look for
Okay.
anything with the House weights.
so what could we adjust? In the house base or weights.
Okay,
You want to drop the base.
drop the base.
That's what you said. You want to lower the.
Oh, drop the base. I thought it was like this music reference.
I'm not musical.
Okay, so I would, and I have had some conversations. I see Ezra's in the room, and I have you're a really talented gentleman that I have met with yesterday. That I do see merit in looking at a mixture of what the House did and what the administration put forward. Looking at not what we're currently spending as adequate, but what we deem as a state is an amount that we think will be able to deliver adequate education, allowing districts to choose to vote more. So I do support an empirically derived, evidence-based amount that is less than what the House proposed. I think that it also will bring the
That's
voter.
empirically derived.
So the administration has had multiple approaches at this, where I'm happy to hear from them some more. I don't support what they originally put out, because I also think they contemplated no involvement of the voter. I see it's very important to keep the voters as part of this conversation, because these are local property taxes for local schools. So the local voter, I think, needs to be critical to this discussion. So I would say that enhanced evidence-based model that was presented to Senate Education is something I'd like to look more at. But I don't know how that stands and where we are in the dispute.
We got that today.
That's where I am. I feel like the voters need to still be a picture part of this, especially with what's contemplated.
I've
Raising
never seen the
taxes.
voters be put out.
But the voters would still be involved in
Yeah.
their supplemental budget.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's critical for supplemental district spending.
Right, but
I hear
the supplemental district on the basics or supplemental spending on,
I would anticipate from my travels in South Burlington, the school board and meetings and so on, if we give them a big chunk of money, they're gonna use that in operations and doing everything they need to do. And then when they start to realize they need a new facility, they need a new elementary school, when they
that's.
need their bases, that's when they're gonna start thinking, well, let's go to the community and ask them if they would vote for these bonds or for this additional spending in order to do this or that.
Maybe we should be engaging the voters now while we're doing this work.
And so I do like the timeline. I think we'll have time over the next election cycle to hear from our voters about where we're landing. I don't think any of us are 100% sure that we're representing the majority of the interests of our constituents.
I'm
You're
not
Chris.
with that shoot.
Who's Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm looking for the shot. We have with the three areas. So the enhanced. That's education, dollars are passed by.
The enhanced one is the one that came in with a day before the Senate
Yes.
Education Committee voted out the bill. They ran
So
in
the
with a
enhanced,
new proposal.
yeah, well, they're still working on this, so I would not bet. The enhanced, the base is 1483. The base,
So that Senate Ed got a.
Committee of Education, Senate, the base is 1488.70.
Oh, yeah.
So they're
What's in the
close. And in the House, it is 1533.
There are assumptions that can be changed from what they did in there. And that's where I was talking with Ezra about the assistant principals, about the number of counselors, about the class and the student ratio for fourth and fifth graders. They went to 18, but we could easily, if we reconsidered a 20, that has a possible cost estimate of $25 million. So there's things that can be done to that evidence-based model to get to a number that will still involve the local districts to choose to spend above that through the equalization.
But remember, in this enhanced model, there is no sparsity weight. I know that won't hurt Chittenden County, but it will hurt some. There's no sparsity weight. There is no figuring in for transportation or special ed costs. So that's not a true base weight. They have just held that all out there. So that's millions of dollars that's going to hit your bottom line when it comes to your school.
I'm just reflecting sentiment that I heard and agree with, that our number of students are going down, but our spending keeps going up, and I see value.
The students.
I see merit in setting a base that will still involve the local constituents, to then also be motivated to look at consolidation as a positive, or not consolidation, but school district coordination, that other aspect of this bill that we're not tackling here. So I see that as being a positive, rather than raising by 33% the tax rate to all the districts that's been traditionally underfunding or voting down budgets.
Those towns, because they are poor, their people are poor. They probably make half on average what the average citizen in Chittenden County makes, are never going to vote on their own to spend $2,000 more per student, because their people don't have the money. So we're trying to figure out a way to raise that money, to raise those students up.
And I think we're doing that both of these years.
No, and I think to that point, if we're gonna take that voice out of their hands, if they can't afford the property tax bill.
Yeah.
We're gonna say, no, but here's the amount of money and your property taxes are gonna go up
Only if we.
based on the numbers we saw
We have
yesterday.
not talked about how we can raise additional funds. This is not this year. This is 3, 4, 5 years out. We have a study on tax classifications. We have historically, set the rate for non-homestead property at a higher rate than this bill anticipates setting it at the same rate. So, but there's a study. The thought is that's a lever we can pull. We can put some more money into the system.
That doesn't solve from my area of the state, does not solve the issue of spending too much money. Because if you set it at 1.8 billion and give them 10% above that, the school districts that lose that funding under this formula are gonna spend that 10%, and we might fall into spending $100 million more than we are right now.
They can't spend it unless we decide they can spend it.
Well,
We have to
it's in the bill.
allow above base spending. And we're gonna require that every student gets the same amount of money. And it's done on a statewide property tax. We set the property tax rate statewide. It's not a local decision. Because we don't, but I drive past 3 of your elementary schools on the way to visit my daughter on Sunday afternoon. It's a 45-minute drive from Montpelier to her house. You don't need 3 elementary schools up there, especially when your population's declining. We've lost 40,000 students. That means it's costing us more per student to provide the same education. The future state, where we have the lower numbers, envisions not a national 2,000 kid in a high school, but a more Vermont 600 kids in a high school, which makes it a lot cheaper because you only need 1 principal, not 6 with 100 kids in a high school. You only need 1 nurse. And that allows you to have money to raise up the salaries. At least that's the vision I've been given by.
Can I ask?
But we're not comparing apples to oranges, talking about now and out there, because their numbers are based on a totally different system in which there will be a very different school configuration. And we're going, and for these schools, that are going to see a tax increase, they might get the incentive. The thought is you get the incentive to maybe join with some of your neighbors. I mean, we saw that hodgepodge of districts and union districts and independent districts and people that became a tuitioning district and then tuition to what was their former public school because they didn't want to get merged with the people literally 5 miles down the road. That's the system we're trying to correct. And the question is, and that's where we will save money. That is where the pain is going to come in. These are all tentative. We are not until we set the district and see where that low spending district is combined in that low spending, what is now a school district, may find itself combined with 3 other high spending districts. So to take today's numbers and
But it's emblematic of what it will be, so it's still a data.
if we do nothing else, it's emblematic of what it will be if we do nothing else. We're trying to let schools know this is our intention. We intend to move to the numbers altered for reality that we're getting from the evidence-based people, altered to Vermont reality. And it is our intention to go to a statewide property tax, which right now, the empirically derived numbers say is going to be based on this amount of spending or that amount of spending. Choose your empirical data source. But if we just go back to, I don't think so, we end up where we started with the weights. I know perfectly well how those weights got the original weights. Somebody sat around a table like this at 10 o'clock at night and said, well, I think 0.3 is a good number. I can live with that. It had no basis in reality.
They were all negotiated.
They were all negotiated. And they didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Dr. Colby's extremely intelligent and bright, and I respect her analysis. It's not infallible what she came up with, and it still ultimately is a political decision because that's why we're here. And that number, as much as it can be empirically derived based on current spending, doesn't mean that's what is the right policy. And to me, the right policy is a lower number, not much lower, but a lower number, still allowing districts to be involved with that decision so that we're not raising taxes as much on the lower spenders. We're raising them a certain amount, raising all ships, especially the ships down there, and then also improving, localizing the vote more so that
You may stay, you might as well stay with your present system.
it's an argument.
I mean, that's. If the towns that want to keep their little tiny school
It's a valid point.
will raise that money.
I think, I'm just trying to, I don't think that voters asked us in November to spend even more money on education. And I mean, just, we have to get this to our floor, we get through our floor, it has to get through the House floor. And I just worry that how many representatives or senators are going to look at, how are they going to vote for something that increases the tax rate on a town in their district, or maybe the town is their district, where it's going to go up 25, 30 cents.
That's if you're
That worries
only looking at today, and I think I'm gonna burn that slot. If you took the statewide property tax and put it into today's system, that's what it would do. That is different than if you take that spending per pupil, which I believe Professor Colby said is less than we are presently spending per pupil on average, all right? That's what, take the whole state, her 15,000 is less than we are presently spending.
It's more, like 20 million.
No,
One,
that's
Yeah,
not what
it
she's,
spends 20 million.
Like,
what are we spending per pupil right now? Do you know, Julia, off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I don't, but I can get that.
It's around, it's a little over 20,000 per people.
but you're talking about the total amount overall.
In FY 25, it was that 1.88 billion.
I'm not talking about the bottom line. She's talking about, she's not talking about the bottom line. She is talking about an empirically derived, and don't ask me how algorithms work. But they put the data in. And this is what it's coming out as. We need to spend per student. And it's less, which I heard her say today, than we are spending. The total comes out different. Because today we are operating under a very different governance. If we took her model, her numbers, and applied them to today's system, that's what the number would be. And I'm looking over here, if I keep
0.908
getting this way off,
Yes.
somebody raised their
It's
hand.
only $28 million difference and $28 million on a $1.9 billion basis. It's a pretty small amount.
And it's $28 million in property, 2% of the tax rate.
We're bringing people up, folks, keep your eye on the prize, we're bringing people.
But it also is not how it
Bring a
works.
lot of your-
It's just-
Mandate.
it's just multiplying
No.
that. It's not how.
When we get to a new system,
First, but I,
then we will know the cost.
is it okay?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Senator Beck, to your point, what people asked us to do, or what we heard now, obviously. It's not like thousands of people have individually asked us to do things, but I think the message from last election was, hey, our property taxes are too high. And we want you to do something about that. We could do that without doing this entire blowing up of our system. We could keep our current funding formula. We could put in a lower excess spending threshold. We could do things to reduce costs, like implement class size things. We could limit tuitioning and private school choice, because that costs our system more. We could not opinion.
No.
We could do other things in our system to reduce costs. With keeping our current funding formula, that we keep
Well, we could,
voters.
could only spend $15,000 a student.
Yeah, we
Here,
could
yeah.
do it within our current funding system. And we could, like I said, limit the cost of certain things, like implement sort of cost saving measures, so to speak. Now, we might be arguing over what those are. But if it's really about we're worried about what the right base amount is, or whose numbers are the right numbers, whether it's something that the administration flew in here at the last minute with, or whether it's an empirically based formula from a national expert, we can have that
It came in
debate.
at the last minute.
It did not come in at the
Came in
last
2
minute.
days before
And
the-
I mean, I hear Senator Chittenden saying, like, we want to maintain a voter voice. I agree. I don't think most people out there understand that they wouldn't be voting on their budgets. Some people might be extremely excited to no longer vote on school budgets, but some people might be really upset. But we don't have to do all of this. But if we want to get to cost savings, it takes time. It takes structural change. And the way to do it is not to underfund what we send to school districts. That is not defensible from a mathematical perspective, from an educational perspective, from a constitutional perspective. So going to a new system that immediately out of the gate underfunds it is just unconscionable. So, and it's easier for some of the schools in your district, because they can always just fundraise more to get more. It is not easy for public schools to do that. So we have to be making sure that we're talking about a level playing field and how we provide a fair and equitable system.
If if we spend $28 million more in an education payment than we do now, and we add, I don't know how much in supplemental spending, that is more property taxes. There's no way around that. And as far as underfunding, I mean, our funding floor right now is a property yield, which is $8,500. That's our floor right now. And we're talking about a floor that's, 90% of 15-ish, which is like 13.5. I mean, this is not a gutting of the education
It's a
system. and the
different
funding.
formula. It's a totally different, it's not an apples to
You
apples.
can't spend more money on education and not tax.
The point you just raised,
Can't
is
do it.
why I see merit over the current system is it would raise that floor. So I also agree that I'm more and more impressed with what we currently do because it keeps the voter voice and has impacts. But to Senator Beck, what he just said, that floor, that dollar yield, that's effectively what we would do if we proceed down this path of raising the foundation amount to raise that floor. Well, all the districts would get more money and pay more money so that we would achieve greater equitable access to educational opportunity by overriding some of the local split votes that are happening when they don't agree with budgets.
We are going to be giving more money to schools that are not spending enough to adequately educate their kids.
Yep.
Okay,
I agree.
all right. So if we say we are not doing that, I'm going to sue. Because we are saying we are not, if this were another state and those kids were, we would be having a lawsuit. All right,
Sounds like you do it right now.
but we have gotten, they're mostly old mill towns, old logging towns, the places where the economy has died out. That don't have the money to adequately educate their kids. So we are condemning those kids not to be adequately educated. We have an obligation, at least I feel, an obligation to float all boats.
Agreed.
All right. If we start out saying we're only going to float your boat up to 25% or 20% below what we say you need to be educated,
That's not what
then
I'm saying.
no, if we funding, if we choose your amount, I mean, choose Picus's amount.
But in all those cases, it would be more than what those districts are currently spending.
But
We would be
that-
raising them
But not,
by a good amount. We would be.
but not, they still won't be able to afford the same education that kids in wealthy towns do.
They won't be able to afford the property tax anyway. If we.
Can I
No,
just add the obvious, which is if we had wanted to lower property taxes, we would have spent this session pulling money out of the ed fund. That was a choice, a policy decision. We didn't make that choice. If we want to start over next January, I'm in. Let's do it. Let's pull money out of the ed fund. That's how you lower property tax.
So
I would
Well,
pay for
funding
property
thing.
taxes by pulling money out of the fund.
You can, you
How-
we
how
put a
are
lot
you
of,
gonna
we fund
do
a
it,
lot of things on
Scott?
the ed fund that we don't need to be funding on the ed fund.
If you pull revenues out of the education funding,
No expenses.
how expensive.
Yes.
School meal.
So you want us reaching into school districts and start
Yeah,
telling them what they
all-
can and can't spend money on? That's what we don't currently have. So like going in and saying to that district, you have this position, that position. Be it for mental
I'm
health or
just
something
saying,
else, we
if
can't
that's the
afford that.
goal, then that's what we should be spending our time doing, and we're not doing it.
We're not doing that in this either. I mean, we're not, and from this Montpelier perch, telling them they can and can't spend money.
We are saying that at the end of this process, when we consolidate schools, then we will charge you. What we're getting freaked out about is if we just took this year without any consolidation, without any efficiency, without anything, and we just took what we're spending now and put it into a statewide property tax, this would be the tax rates. And we're freaking out over that. But that's like saying, if we took what we did now and applied it to 1850, this is what the result would be. We have an obligation to change the system so that we spend more money or the same amount of money or a lower amount. And then Tammy Colby said today, if you change the system, her numbers are based on the number of schools we have today, the amount of money we're spending today. If we go, and I can get my districts that have 4 and 5 elementary schools, and I can get them down to 2 elementary schools each, then the cost is going down.
I'm sure you made a really good point earlier. How if we have 5% for SES, it's easier to go to 10% than at 10% lowering 5. If we go up 50-33, it is next to impossible next year, the year after to go down. But if we
No, it's
do a
never
lower amount, it's a lot easier to go up. So.
Never impossible to go
You
down.
can't go down.
We are not going to 1533 next year. We are not going to 1533 until 26, 28, 30. Pick your
That's
date.
my point, is that if we went lower, it'd be easier to raise that amount next year.
But
with more
We're
patience.
not raising it next year. We're not raising it until the entire system has changed. So stop thinking about taking that number and imposing it on the present system. We're not talking about taking the future EV motor and putting it in a 1950s Ford. We're only can talk about it when you get all the other surrounding system change. And I think that's where we're getting bogged down. It's not what we're presently spending. And it's not our present tax rates. It's what we should be spending in the future with a changed system, a more efficient system.
So to that argument, why wouldn't we take the EV model and ramp into it? If that's what the future state
That's
would
what-
be,
yes,
why
that's
would
what
we
we're trying
ramp into it?
We're trying to move into the EV model.
Instead of taking the, I don't know what it's
Cost
called,
factor.
cost factor analysis and trying to ramp into it and then ramp out of it into an
Well,
EV.
we have,
Why would you just ramp into an EV?
well, that's what we're trying to do. She's saying, this is the base. This is what it would cost under the present system. So you start with that in your thought process. You're not going to impose it on the present. That's what it'll cost 3 years down the road. If we don't, it will ramp down from there. That's what an education costs now. And a large number of schools are spending that, and another number of schools are spending more than that, and a number is spending less. The idea is to get everybody to that middle level. So we're going to ramp up some and ramp down others. And we're going to change the system, the delivery system. So
I'm just not persuaded that this is a good policy to go in direction to go with where we would on the current levels and ultimately anticipate not having voters vote on them. So I'm just not convinced what the House did, and even where Senate Ed came in is good policy for Vermont.
okay. So you're not convinced that we should go to a foundation formula.
I think we should do an evidence-based amount with allowing for districts to vote above that with an equalization ratio on that, optional additional spending.
Well, that's
That's
what
good.
we're talking about.
Okay, but my point is the 1533 will effectively spend as much, if not a little bit more than we're currently spending. And to me, to make this work politically and good policy wise, that has to be a lower amount.
That 1533 won't be the number
What's in the
when we
bill?
get to the consolidated district.
1487.
All right, if that's what it would cost now. If we if we took everything, the present system, and if we took the empirical number, and that's what the number is. But we're not imposing that on the present system. We're imposing it on a future system, which will be more efficient.
It seems like we're at a kind of, Mobius strip.
Yeah, and I'm under either a break or, I don't know what your, what your goals are
Thinking,
today.
well, I am thinking maybe we need to stop. Okay. And let various
Yeah.
things happen. But if you're going to have to make these decisions and do nothing could be our decision. Our bill could strike everything. And we could say, we just want to stick with the present system and the present spend in the future.
That's a real decision. Yeah, I mean, it's not a criticism. But that would be a tremendous disservice to most spending districts.
Yes.
They are getting pounded right now by that Irish thing.
Yes, they are.
All I can say is I'm looking at census figures. Vermont spent the most per pupil of any state in the United States in 2024, totaling $26,974. That message is in my mind all the time. Why do we spend more per pupil than anybody else in the nation for results that are not the best in the nation or even close?
We have systemic NIMBYism where people won't develop their towns and their municipalities, and yet they still want their boutique school. That's one of the problems.
Mhm.
It's all over read the newspaper. I mean, that is a problem.
We're all old. We aren't building housing. Our birth rate, I think, is now the lowest, if not, it's the second lowest. We don't have a student. I don't know. We had 67 students. It now has less than 10. But we
What's
still
education
have
gonna
the,
cost when there's only one student left in Vermont?
we still have the same schools, the same number of schools, the same everything. The future state is envisioning that some of those high schools who are presently now talking about merging. But if we used to pay a teacher to teach 20 students, they're now teaching 10. But the number of funders in there are down. So we've got,
And we're now teaching 10 and we have 5 paraeducators in the same classroom
Right.
at the same time. I mean,
Right.
it isn't rocket science.
because
That's what the issues are that need to be dealt with. And education funding can be dealt with in a vacuum.
That's just not.
You can afford to go to elementary schools. You cannot afford a 3.6 3-to-1 staffing ratio. We
Yeah.
cannot.
We cannot.
We seem to have lost our camera.
Oh, it's.
Oh, that's okay. That's fine. I think we're
It's
about
still on.
done, right?
I think we're done. Open the door, everybody go home. We'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow, guys, we have got a long floor session, so plan on being here late. Tomorrow is Wednesday.